civilization mission, dressing up barbarism without a name, the cross or the crescent. This paper critically examines the assertion that no inch of turf was unoccupied on Earth when the myth of cross or crescent emerged, transforming religious doctrines into ideological weapons for invasion, occupation, resource and slave labor extraction, committing genocides, ethnocides, and ecocide under the garb clad with terra nullius and civilization mission. Special attention is paid to the role of male 𝗕𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃, the patriarchal, male-dominated structures of both religious institutions and military forces, in perpetuating this violence under the guise of God's command, cultural annihilation, the most dangerous than the gun-carrying killer militias. The paper concludes that what was aggressively branded as a civilizing endeavor was, in reality, barbarism without limits, leaving a lasting legacy of injustice and trauma globally that they still don't think about, let alone do justice to the sheer insanity of the whole criminal enterprise. No, they justify it. The history of humanity is, in large part, a history of movement, settlement, and interaction with land. Yet, a fundamental premise underpinning much of the world's colonial and imperial violence rests upon a foundational lie: the concept of terra nullius, or empty land. This paper asserts that, by the time the ideological frameworks of the cross or crescent, representing the expansionist phases of Christianity and Islam, were fully weaponized, virtually no inch of turf on planet Earth was truly unoccupied. Instead, lands were teeming with diverse human societies, complex ecologies, and intricate systems of governance, spirituality, and resource management. This paper argues that the myth of these religious expansions, not as faith systems, but as justifications for conquest, provided potent ideological weapons, transforming what was presented as God's command or a civilization mission into an unparalleled era of barbarism without limits. Furthermore, it highlights the deeply patriarchal nature of these invasions, embodied in the male 𝗕𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃 that led them, systematically imposing their will and structures upon existing, often more egalitarian, societies. Through a critical examination of historical narratives, the paper seeks to expose the profound hypocrisy and devastating consequences of these religiously sanctioned acts of conquest. The myth of terra nullius, an occupied world. The assertion that no inch of turf was unoccupied fundamentally challenges the colonial doctrine of terra nullius, which posited that lands not demonstrably civilized or settled by European standards were vacant and thus available for appropriation. This doctrine was instrumental in justifying the forceful seizure of lands from indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, Australia, and parts of Asia. However, archaeological, anthropological, and historical evidence overwhelmingly refutes terra nullius. Prior to European arrival, the Americas, for instance, supported sophisticated civilizations such as the Incas, Aztecs, and Mayans, alongside countless smaller nations and tribal groups, all with established geopolitical boundaries, complex trade networks, and diverse agricultural practices. Mann, 2005. Similarly, vast swathes of Africa were home to powerful empires, e.g. Mali, Great Zimbabwe, intricate tribal federations, and settled agricultural communities long before the scramble for Africa. Bohan, 1987. Australia's Aboriginal peoples, for millennia, developed intricate systems of land stewardship, spiritual connection, and customary law that governed every aspect of their interaction with their territories. Pascoe, 2014. These societies, regardless of their technological or political structures from a Eurocentric viewpoint, all maintained active occupancy, management, and often profound spiritual connections to their lands. Their landscapes were not untouched wilderness, but rather carefully managed environments shaped by human activity, agricultural practice, and spiritual belief. The language of discovery and unoccupied land served precisely to dehumanize existing populations, erase their sovereignty, and legitimize their dispossession, paving the way for the brutal imposition of foreign rule. The cross and crescent as ideological weapons. The historical trajectory of both Christianity and Islam, particularly during their periods of expansion, reveals how deeply spiritual doctrines could be reinterpreted and leveraged as potent ideological weapons for conquest. Under the banner of divine mandate and promises of salvation or righteous rule, vast empires were forged, and diverse peoples subjugated, with religious fervor often serving as the primary justification for territorial acquisition and violent subjugation. Yet, this grand narrative of divinely sanctioned expansion conspicuously sidelined, indeed largely omitted, the experiences and voices of women. While both faiths claimed to transmit the unequivocal Word of God, the sacred texts themselves, and their subsequent interpretations and codifications were overwhelmingly the product of male scholarship, male authority, and often anonymously penned male perspectives. This foundational male-centric authorship not only shaped the theological frameworks, but also implicitly sanctioned the patriarchal structures that defined societal roles and power dynamics for centuries, rendering God's Word a reflection of human, specifically male, socio-political realities rather than a truly universal divine utterance. The Crescent, early Islamic expansion. The early Islamic conquests, beginning in the 7th century CE, rapidly spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into parts of Europe and Asia. While motivated by a complex mix of religious fervor, political ambition, and economic factors, the concept of jihad, often interpreted as holy struggle, and the division of the world into Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, and Dar al-𝗵𝗺𝗶𝘀𝗵𝗺𝗵, the abode of war, provided a powerful framework for expansion. Kennedy, 2004. The promise of reward in the afterlife for those who died in battle for the faith, coupled with the imposition of jizya, a tax on non-Muslims, and the option of conversion, served as a comprehensive strategy for territorial acquisition and the consolidation of power. While Islamic law often protected people of the book, Jews and Christians, as dhimmis, allowing them to practice their faith under certain conditions, the primary goal was the expansion of Islamic rule and the establishment of a caliphate, often through military conquest over existing political entities and populations. This expansion was not into empty lands, but into established empires and kingdoms: Byzantine, Sasanian, Visigothic Spain, and various North African and Central Asian polities. The Cross, Crusades, and European colonialism. Similarly, Christian expansion, particularly from the late 11th century with the Crusades and later during the Age of Exploration, employed its religious doctrines for territorial and political gain. The Crusades, initially aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim rule, were explicitly sanctioned by the papacy as holy wars offering spiritual salvation to participants. Riley Smith, 2005. This concept of a religiously mandated war against infidels or heathens would later be resurrected and adapted to justify European colonial expansion globally. The papal bulls of the 15th century, such as 𝗵𝗵𝗫𝗀𝗃, 1452, and 𝗕𝗏𝗄𝗃, 1493, explicitly granted Christian monarchs the right to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and other property whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. This doctrine of discovery became the legal and theological bedrock for European powers to claim lands and subjugate peoples across the Americas, Africa, and beyond. Miller, et al., 2010. The cross thus became an emblem not merely of faith, but of conquest, enslavement, and the spiritual and physical subjugation of non-Christian populations, turning the myth of religious superiority into a license for invasion. Male, XY hoods, patriarchal domination and the imposition of order. The prompt's evocative phrase, male, XY hoods, pointedly highlights the intensely patriarchal nature of these expansionist movements. These invasions were overwhelmingly conceived, led, and executed by men, who then imposed their male-dominated societal structures upon the conquered. In both Islamic and Christian expansion, military leadership was almost exclusively male. Caliphs, sultans, popes, kings, and generals, all were men, operating within and reinforcing deeply patriarchal religious and political systems. The invading forces themselves were composed predominantly of male soldiers, who, in addition to physical conquest, often engaged in sexual violence, further entrenching male dominance and demoralizing conquered populations. Spivak, 1988. Beyond the battlefield, the civilization mission, championed by these male 𝗕𝗄𝗃𝗀𝗃 entailed the systematic dismantling of existing indigenous gender relations and the imposition of a rigid patriarchal order. Many indigenous societies, particularly in the Americas and Africa, possessed more fluid, complementary, or even matrilineal gender roles, with women often holding significant spiritual, economic, and political power. Purdue, 1999. 𝗂𝗶𝘁𝗵𝗂, 1997. The arrival of European colonizers, driven by Judeo-Christian patriarchal norms, often suppressed these roles, relegated women to domestic spheres, and introduced new forms of gendered violence and exploitation. The hoods here represent not just individual men, but the entire ideological and structural edifice of male supremacy that was foundational to both the invading cultures and the systems they sought to implant globally. This imposition was integral to their notion of civilizing the barbaric natives, enforcing a specific male-dominated social hierarchy as part of God's command. The civilization mission, indeed barbarism without limits. The grand rhetoric of the civilization, bring light, order, true religion, and progress to the savage or uncivilized peoples, stands in stark contrast to the unparalleled barbarity that characterized these invasions. Under the veneer of divine mandate and benevolent upliftment, colonizers unleashed a torrent of violence and destruction. Genocide and demographic catastrophe. In the Americas, the arrival of Europeans led to a demographic collapse of indigenous populations on an unprecedented scale, primarily due to disease, but also through systematic massacres, forced labor, and deliberate starvation. Stannard, 1992. This was not merely an unfortunate consequence, but often an explicit strategy to clear land for settlement. Slavery and forced labor. Both Islamic and Christian empires engaged in extensive systems of slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, driven by European powers and sanctioned by theological arguments, forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas, reducing them to chattel and exploiting their labor for centuries. Beckles, 2016. Similarly, indigenous populations were subjected to forced labor regimes, e.g., encomienda and mita systems in Spanish America, that decimated communities and destroyed ways of life. Cultural and spiritual eradication. Missionaries, often integral to the civilization mission, actively sought to destroy indigenous spiritual practices, languages, and cultural traditions, deeming them pagan or demonic. Sacred sites were desecrated, spiritual leaders persecuted, and children forcibly removed from their families to be re-educated in colonial institutions, e.g., residential schools in Canada and the U.S., missions in Australia, leading to profound intergenerational trauma. Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, 2015. Resource extraction and ecological devastation. The primary economic motivation for many invasions was the insatiable demand for resources: gold, silver, timber, furs, land. This led to rapacious extraction practices that devastated indigenous economies and irrevocably altered ecosystems, often driven by a colonial logic of exploiting nature for profit rather than living in harmony with it. Crosby, 1986. Political dispossession and the imposition of alien governance. Existing indigenous systems of governance, law, and social organization were systematically dismantled and replaced with colonial administrative structures designed to benefit the colonizers. This resulted in the total loss of political autonomy for countless nations and the imposition of artificial borders that continue to fuel conflict today. These acts, far from civilizing, represent a profound and unlimited barbarism that reshaped the world through violence, exploitation, and the deliberate destruction of pre-existing lifeways. The god's command served as the ultimate moral alibi for systematic cruelty and unparalleled avarice, leaving a legacy of profound injustice that persists to this day. Conclusion. The assertion that no inch of turf which is not occupied on planet Earth at the time of the myth of Cross or Crescent was born is not hyperbole but a crucial historical correction. It reframes the age of religious expansion and European colonialism not as periods of discovery or civilization, but as an intentional project of invasion, dispossession, and violence against established, diverse, and sovereign peoples. The ideological weapons of the cross or crescent, wielded by male XY hoods operating under the guise of God's command, unleashed a civilization mission that was, in its practical application, nothing short of barbarism without limits. The legacy of this barbarism is etched into the global landscape. In stolen lands, enduring poverty, intergenerational trauma, persistent racial hierarchies, and ongoing struggles for decolonization. Contemporary global power relations, economic dependencies, geopolitical hierarchies, and cultural hegemonies remain structurally linked to the extraction, dispossession, and demographic catastrophes that accompanied empire building. Rodney, 1972. 𝗵𝗶𝘃𝗀𝗃, 2001. To dismantle these continuities, scholars must first confront the historical reality. Colonization was not a benign exchange, but a systematic program of violence, including acts that meet modern definitions of genocide. Hodgson, 2015. Understanding this history demands a dismantling of the myths that continue to obscure it, recognizing that the foundations of modern global power structures are built upon acts of profound injustice. Only by confronting the reality of this past can societies truly begin to address the enduring impacts of colonialism and work towards a more equitable and just future.